I was in my late 20s, working as a security guard at a large hotel in Las Vegas. It wasn't the job of my dreams, but it paid better than most jobs I was qualified for. The only real downside was the schedule. The hotel was short-staffed, so my shifts were all over the place. Sometimes I'd work mornings, other days it would be late at night, or even overnight. It was exhausting, and my sleep schedule was a mess. Still, I couldn't complain too much. The money made it worth it. One night, I was working the evening shift, which was pretty common. It was around 11 p.m., and my shift ended at midnight. I was hanging out at the front desk, talking to two of my coworkers, just killing time until we could clock out. We were in the middle of a conversation when the phone on the desk rang. I glanced at the number. It was from one of the hotel rooms. Nothing unusual, so I picked up. "Front desk, how can I help you?" I asked. On the other end, a man's voice answered, but he sounded frantic. "There's something strange going on in one of the rooms down the hall," he said. "I'm really worried about it." I paused for a second, confused. "What do you mean?" I asked. His voice got even more nervous. "You need to come up here." "I'm getting really scared," he said, almost panicking now. I told him I'd send security up right away, which of course meant I'd be going up myself. After I hung up, I quickly explained the situation to my coworkers. They looked just as puzzled as I felt. It wasn't every day that we got calls like this. I headed to the elevators, feeling a bit uneasy but trying not to show it. I went to the floor where the call came from and stepped out into the hallway. It was quiet, too quiet actually. The silence felt heavy, like something was off. I expected to hear whatever had freaked the guy out, but there was nothing. No noise, no sign of anything unusual. I walked down the hall toward the room. I thought the caller might be standing by the door, waiting for me, but when I got there, the door was closed and there was no one around. I knocked loudly, announcing myself as hotel security. Nothing. No sound, no movement from inside the room. I knocked again, waiting a little longer this time. Still nothing. After a minute or two, I started feeling nervous. This whole situation was weird. I walked to the end of the hallway, listening closely for anything strange. But everything was quiet, so I went back and knocked on the door again. Just then, the door behind me creaked open. I turned around to see an older woman peeking out. She looked scared. "Are you with security?" she asked quietly. "Yeah, I am," I said. "Did you hear anything strange coming from this room?" I pointed to the door where the call had come from. The woman nodded. "A few minutes ago, I heard loud noises, like something was banging around. It sounded like it was coming through the hallway, but I didn't know what it was," she said, her voice shaky. She seemed genuinely frightened. I thanked her and told her to stay in her room while I figured out what was going on. As she closed her door, I grabbed my walkie-talkie and called down to the front desk. "Hey, can you try calling that room again and let me know if they answer?" I asked. A few moments later, the front desk responded. "No answer," they said. Now I was starting to feel really uneasy. The caller had sounded so freaked out, and now there was no answer. I radioed back to the desk and asked them to check who was supposed to be staying in the room. There was a long pause on the other end, and I felt my pulse quicken as I waited for a response. Finally, they got back to me. No one's booked in that room tonight," they said. I blinked, feeling a cold chill run down my spine. "Nobody?" I repeated. "Yeah, it's supposed to be empty," the front desk confirmed. At that point, I didn't know what to think. I pulled out my security key card and swiped it to open the door. Since the room was supposed to be empty, I figured I'd better check it out myself. I stepped inside, and the room looked completely normal. It was clean, the bed was made, and everything seemed unused. There were no signs that anyone had been in there. I searched the entire room, closets, bathroom, under the bed, but found nothing. It was like nobody had ever been there. But then I noticed the phone. It was sitting on the nightstand, the same phone that had called the front desk just 15 minutes earlier. I turned it over and wrote down the serial number. I wanted to make sure that the call had actually come from this room. After leaving the room, I went back down to the lobby and checked the call logs. Sure enough, there was a record of a call being made from that room at the exact time I had answered it. Someone had definitely used that phone. I sat at my desk, feeling uneasy. How could a call have come from an empty room? And why had the man sounded so scared? I had no answers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The next morning, things got even stranger. One of the guests on that same floor was reported missing by a family member who was staying in another room. They hadn't seen him since the previous night. Security footage showed the guest leaving the hotel alone a few hours before I got that call. He hadn't returned, and no one had heard from him since. We reviewed all the footage from the hotel's entrances and exits, but there was no sign of him coming back. It was like he had vanished. I couldn't help but wonder if the call I received was somehow connected to the missing guest. The timing was too close to be a coincidence, but the person who made that call, whoever they were, was never identified, and the mystery of what happened in that room remains unsolved. As of today, the missing person still hasn't been found. I don't know who called me that night or what they were trying to tell me, but it's something I've never been able to forget. It still haunts me, even all these years later. I was 19, working at this sketchy motel that seemed to attract nothing but trouble. The place was run down, and most of the guests were locals, usually up to no good. The cops were regulars, showing up sometimes more than once a week. I worked both at the front desk, checking in all kinds of shady people at all hours, and in housekeeping, cleaning up after them. It wasn't a great job, but it paid the bills. One afternoon, I was assigned to clean rooms in the second building, the one furthest from the office. I always hated it over there. The rooms were in bad shape, and it was always too quiet. I was cleaning one of the last rooms when I saw something in the mirror. A man in his 50s, with greasy hair, just staring at me. I screamed, completely freaked out. The room was supposed to be empty, so he had no reason to be there. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there with a crooked grin on his face, holding out $100 bill. Right away, I knew something was wrong. Who tips $100 for a $40 room? He introduced himself as Terry, said he was staying in the room next door with his wife, Cherie. He smelled like car oil and alcohol, and it made me feel sick. Then he said, "We've been watching you. We want to have some fun." My heart dropped. I tried to brush him off politely, but he kept insisting, telling me to meet his wife. I knew there was no wife. It was just him, and he was seriously creeping me out. I finally got him to leave, but I was shaking. I tried calling my manager, but the phone wasn't working. That's when I started to panic. Was he coming back? Did he mess with the phone line? My cell phone was outside on my housekeeping cart, but the door was locked, and I was too scared to go get it. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to grab my key card and run for it. As soon as I stepped outside, I heard him shouting behind me, and I knew he was chasing me. I ran to a stockroom, locked the door, and hid until I couldn't hear him anymore. When I finally made it to the front desk, I collapsed into my boss's arms, and he called the police. By the time the cops arrived, the guy and whoever else was with him were gone. It turned out he had a criminal record: sexual assault, gross sexual imposition, even rape. I quit shortly after that. The whole thing terrified me, and I promised myself I'd never work at another motel again. The first time I went to Las Vegas wasn't planned. I was on a cross-country road trip, and Vegas was along the way. I figured I'd stop for a night and see what it was all about. But there was one big problem. I was only 20, and you have to be 21 to check into the big casino hotels. So I didn't have many options for a place to stay. I ended up booking a room at a sketchy motel near the Strip. It was the kind of place with a sex shop and strip club right across the street. Definitely not somewhere you'd want to be after dark. From the moment we got there, the whole vibe was off. The guy in the room above us was creeping me out, smoking a cigarette and staring at us while we unloaded the car. The door to our room looked like it had been busted open a few times too. As soon as we got inside, we barricaded the door with a rug and a chair, locked everything, and hoped for the best. But nothing could have prepared us for what happened next. We tried watching TV to distract ourselves, but the guy upstairs started making all kinds of noise, stomping around, talking loudly on the phone, moving furniture. Then things got worse. We heard voices outside, and then a heated argument broke out. It escalated into full-on shouting, And at one point, I'm pretty sure I heard a woman scream. I thought about calling the front desk or the cops, but hesitated. I didn't want to get involved. But when the yelling turned into loud banging and crashing, I knew I had to do something. I called 911 and reported what was happening. The cops showed up fast. Before we knew it, the parking lot was full of flashing lights and sirens. My girlfriend and I hid in the bathroom, scared there might be a shootout or something. Luckily, it didn't come to that. We listened as the cops stormed the building and arrested the guy upstairs. Later, we found out what had happened. The guy had ordered a prostitute but couldn't pay her, so he tried to force himself on her. It was a horrifying thought, and I felt guilty for not acting sooner. In the end, the guy tried to run but got tased by the cops. He fell down a flight of stairs and cracked his head open. It was a harsh reminder of how dangerous Vegas can be, especially when you're too young to drink or gamble. Growing up, I always thought those big, fancy hotels were safer than those one-star motels. Statistically, maybe they are, but I learned the hard way that weird things can happen anywhere. It all started when I was heading to a family reunion in the middle of nowhere. The host had a big place and lots of people were staying there, but I needed my own space to unwind from all the in-law stress. The only hotel nearby was this huge one at the intersection of two major roads, so I booked a room. Other family members had the same idea since it was the only decent option around. When I checked in before going to the reunion, I noticed this guy in the lobby who didn't seem to fit in. He was older, kind of thin, with wild hair and this intense stare that creeped me out. I brushed it off, but I could feel him watching me. After the reunion, when I came back late that night, I saw him again. He was still sitting in the same spot, still staring at the entrance. I tried to avoid him, but as I headed to the elevator, he followed me and started talking. His breath smelled awful, and I could barely stand being near him. I tried to be polite and shut down the conversation, but he kept moving closer. I managed to slip away by taking the stairs and got to my room, thinking I was in the clear. But when I went to get some ice from the machine down the hall, there he was again, grinning in this really disturbing way. He said something about wanting to taste me, and I felt sick. Without thinking, I threw the ice at him and ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. I was shaking and called the front desk, telling them what happened. They sent someone up to check on the guy, but I spent the whole night feeling like I was being watched. The next morning, I checked out early. I ended up staying with my family for the rest of the reunion, figuring anything was better than dealing with that creepy old guy. My trip through the Scottish Highlands started off exciting. It was always a dream of mine to explore this beautiful place on my own, without the schedules and plans of family vacations. I never expected it to turn into a nightmare that would leave me scared and shaken. I rented a car in London and headed north, planning to visit the town of Malag. This was the beginning of a backpacking trip across Europe, or so I thought. As I drove through the highlands, amazed by the scenery, I spotted a small inn by the side of the road. It looked cozy and welcoming, so I decided to stop for the night. The innkeeper greeted me warmly, showing me to my room and chatting about local sights. I was thankful for her kindness and looked forward to a good night's rest before continuing my trip. But what seemed like a peaceful stay quickly took a dark turn. As night fell and the other guests went to their rooms, it was just me, the innkeeper, and the cook, who had been busy in the kitchen. I couldn't sleep, so I talked with the innkeeper, and she offered me a few drinks to help me relax. I'm not much of a drinker, but I didn't want to be rude, so I agreed. What started as a small drink turned into shot after shot, with the innkeeper filling my glass faster than I could finish. I had a bad feeling, but I ignored it. Soon, I was stumbling, unable to talk clearly. That's when I realized something was very wrong. I tried to leave, but the cook blocked me, pushing me toward the stairs leading to the cellar. With a hard hit to my back, I fell down the stairs, everything spinning before I passed out. When I woke up, I was alone. My head hurt and my side throbbed with pain. It didn't take long for me to realize what had happened. They drugged me and stole one of my kidneys. Terrified, I managed to get to my car. With no phone or wallet, I had to flag down a stranger for help. The police were called, but by the time they arrived, the innkeeper and cook were long gone, along with any trace of the inn. I went home, feeling violated and betrayed. What was supposed to be a trip of a lifetime turned into a nightmare that I'll never forget. The people who did this are still out there, hidden somewhere in the highlands, a reminder that even the most beautiful places can hide real danger. Last year, I was on a road trip and planned to be gone for a few days. On the second night, I ended up in the middle of nowhere with no clue where I was going to sleep. I wanted to find a hotel, but as I kept driving, it felt like I was getting farther from any town. My phone signal kept dropping, which made it hard to check for places to stay. By around 11 p.m., I pulled into a rest area and searched for nearby hotels. The closest option was a motel about 12 miles away, and even though I was exhausted, I decided to go for it. The motel was small and old, and the town it was in looked like it hadn't seen much action in years. The place gave me an eerie feeling. It had about 10 or 12 rooms, all on one level, with a small office attached to the side. When I arrived, the parking lot was almost empty, and the whole place reminded me of a scene from a horror movie. But it was cheap, just $29 for the night, so I figured it would be fine since I planned to leave early in the morning. I went to the office, where a man with a long beard sat behind the counter. He barely glanced at me when I asked for a room. I handed over the $29, got the key, and headed to my room. The room was exactly what I expected, outdated and not very clean. The furniture looked old, and the TV was one of those big boxy ones from forever ago. I wasn't going to complain though, I just wanted to sleep. So I got ready for bed and lay down. After only a few minutes of lying there, I started to drift off, but then I felt this weird sensation, like something wasn't right. I opened my eyes and turned toward the window. That's when I saw someone moving away from it. It didn't seem like they were just passing by. It looked like they had been watching me. I couldn't tell who it was, but it made my skin crawl. I got up and closed the curtains, though they were so cheap they didn't fully cover the window. They were thin enough that you could almost see through them. But it was better than nothing. I peeked outside, but whoever had been there was gone. Trying to shake it off, I went back to bed, though I wasn't as relaxed anymore. I was still tired enough to eventually drift off again. But then that uneasy feeling hit me again. This time, I was already facing the window, so I opened my eyes, and sure enough, there was someone standing there again. At first, it was hard to see because of the flimsy curtains, but I caught a glimpse of a man's head before he moved away. I couldn't make out any details, but it was definitely someone. Now I was really spooked. I got up, looked out the window again, but the person had disappeared. The door was locked, and I tried to cover the window as best as I could, but I still didn't feel safe. I wanted to go back to sleep, but it took me a long time to relax. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I woke up to the sound of my door squeaking open. It was an old, creaky door, so it made a lot of noise. I snapped awake and sat up. There was a man coming into my room. At first, I didn't know who he was, but as soon as he saw me awake, he bolted out the door. That's when I realized it was the guy from the front desk. I jumped out of bed, threw my stuff together as fast as I could, and got out of there. I drove back to the highway and ended up sleeping in my car at a rest stop for the rest of the night. As crazy as it sounds, I felt way safer in my car than I had at that motel. The next morning, I tried to call the motel to report what happened, but they hung up on me the moment I started explaining. So, I called the police and told them everything. I don't know what they did about it, but that guy was definitely a creep. I'm just glad I woke up when I did, because I don't even want to think about what could have happened if I hadn't. I really hope he doesn't do that to anyone else. Back in the summer of 2010, when I was just becoming a teenager, my family took a trip to a fancy hotel in the city. I don't remember why we went, but a lot of my family and some friends were there, staying in rooms near ours. I never asked my parents why we were there, but it didn't seem important at the time. I've always been a bit of a scaredy cat. I was a skinny, fragile kid who got spooked easily, and honestly, that still happens to me sometimes. But what happened at that hotel wasn't just me being scared. It was way more than that. The hotel was kind of weird. The lobby was on the fourth floor, which I thought was strange, and the only way to get there was by elevator. You couldn't use the stairs to reach it. The whole place was shaped like a square, with balconies on each floor where you could look down at the lobby and cafe below. I was always nervous walking near the balcony, worried I might fall, but the railing was high enough to keep me from freaking out too much. The first couple of days were fun. My friends and I played cards and watched TV. At night, we explored the halls of the hotel, telling ghost stories and having a good time. I didn't really understand why we were there, but I didn't care much either. Then, on the third day, things got strange. I woke up early to the sound of screaming outside my room. The hotel's design made noises from the lobby echo up to the top floors, so I went out to the balcony to see what was going on. Down in the lobby, I saw a girl lying on the ground with eggs and milk splattered everywhere. People were rushing to help her, and some were yelling for someone to call the cops. The girl looked like she was knocked out. I saw my family down in the lobby having breakfast, so I decided to head down and find out what happened. The elevator was on the opposite side of my floor, so I decided to take the stairs since they were right next to my room. We were staying on the 7th or 8th floor, so I figured it wouldn't take too long. As I went down the stairs, I kept expecting to find the 4th floor for the lobby, but I kept walking without seeing any doors. I passed the 5th floor, but there was still no sign for the lobby. I kept walking, thinking maybe I'd missed something, but then I realized I'd gone way past the 3rd and 2nd floors too. By now, I should have turned back, but I didn't want to climb all those stairs again, so I kept going. At the bottom, I ended up in a cold, dimly lit room with concrete floors and cinder block walls. There were double doors in front of me, and I figured they might lead back to the lobby, so I opened them and stepped inside. It was a huge storage room, probably as big as a basketball court. The only light was coming from the stairwell behind me, so I couldn't see much. I thought it was just part of the hotel's storage. In the back of the room, I saw an elevator. It looked bigger than the others, so I walked over, hoping it would take me back up. But when I pressed the button, nothing happened. There was a card swiper next to it, so I figured it was for employees only. Feeling disappointed, I turned back to the stairwell door. That's when I realized it was locked. Panic started to set in. I didn't have a phone because my parents wouldn't let me have one until I graduated middle school, so I had no way to call for help. Everyone probably thought I was still asleep in my room. I was starting to freak out. I searched the storage room, hoping to find another way out, but every door was locked. I started to cry, feeling more scared than I ever had before. It felt like hours had passed, but really, it had only been a few minutes when I heard a door creak open. It wasn't the stairwell door. It was another door on the opposite side of the room. A slim, middle-aged man in a lab coat walked in. At the time, I didn't think it was strange for someone in a lab coat to be in a hotel. I was just relieved to see an adult. I ran over to him, tears in my eyes, and told him I got lost and locked in the basement. I asked if he had a key, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he said he knew a way out and told me to follow him. He seemed nervous, and even though the room was dimly lit, I could see sweat on his forehead. He kept looking around like he wasn't sure where he was. We walked past the stairwell, and I started to feel uneasy. The man seemed lost, checking his surroundings like it was his first time there. We turned a corner and headed toward a bunch of boxes, which led to a dead end. That's when I froze. Something felt really wrong. I asked him, "Where are we going?" He just told me to keep following him, but I knew there weren't any doors where we were headed. I had already checked that area. Then a wave of panic hit me. I started screaming as loud as I could. The man got frustrated, plugging his ears and yelling at me to stop. But I kept screaming, not knowing what else to do. He eventually snapped and started walking toward me quickly. I ran for the stairwell door, hoping somehow it would open. He didn't run after me, just muttered things like "stupid kid" as he followed behind me. Just as I reached the door, it opened. A janitor came through, hearing my screams from the stairwell. He saw me and the man in the lab coat and immediately told me to get behind him. The janitor asked who the man was, and I said I didn't know. The janitor quietly radioed for help, mentioning that the man had come from outside. The guy in the lab coat started making excuses, saying he was just looking for a bathroom, but the janitor wasn't buying it. He told the man to wait for security. Eventually, someone from the front desk showed up and took me back to the lobby, where I found my family. They hadn't even realized I was missing. I never found out who that man was or what he was doing there, but I'm so thankful for that janitor. I don't know what the guy in the lab coat was planning, but I'm glad I trusted my gut and started screaming. This past summer, I had a strange experience while staying at a hotel just outside a big city. It was a nice place, nicer than most places I've stayed before. After I checked in, I left the hotel and didn't come back until around 10 p.m. When I got to my room on the second floor, I realized I didn't have my key. I must have lost it somewhere. So I went down to the front desk, told them what happened, and got a new key. After that, I headed back to my room, got ready for bed, and fell asleep pretty fast since I was so tired. A little while later, I woke up to the sound of my door handle turning. Half asleep, I was confused and thought maybe I was dreaming. But then, I heard the door creak open. It was strange because it was almost midnight, and no one should have been coming into my room. From where I was lying in bed, I couldn't see the door because the bathroom was between me and the entrance. I got up to check, but by the time I got to the door, it had already closed, and no one was there. It creeped me out, but I thought maybe it was just someone accidentally trying the wrong room. I looked through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. I was about to go back to bed when I saw something. As I glanced toward the bathroom, I saw a figure standing there in the dark, staring right at me. My heart dropped and I panicked. Without thinking, I ran out of the room and down the hallway, straight to the lobby. When I got to the front desk, I told the clerk someone had been in my room. They came back up with me to check, but by the time we got there, the person was gone. I didn't feel safe staying in that room, so I asked for a different one, and thankfully, they had another room on the third floor. I grabbed my things and moved there for the rest of the night. Looking back, I'm pretty sure I dropped my key somewhere, and whoever found it used it to get into my room. Instead of walking in, they must have hidden in the bathroom. I'm just glad I saw them when I did, and was able to get out. It was definitely one of the creepiest things that's ever happened to me. A few years ago, I was driving down an old highway late at night for work. They didn't fly me out, so I had to drive, but at least I get reimbursed. I don't enjoy long drives, but I was making good time and accidentally passed the city where I planned to stop for the night. By then, I wasn't sure when I'd hit the next decent-sized city with a hotel. By midnight, I was getting tired, but realized I was about 5 hours ahead of schedule. I pulled off the highway to get gas and noticed a sign for an old motel down the road. It didn't look great, but I was too tired to care, so I decided to give it a try. The motel was pretty basic, just 2 levels with rooms facing the parking lot. I got a room on the first floor, way at the end. When I went inside, I was surprised. It wasn't as bad as I expected. The bed was comfortable, the room was clean, and there was a decent-sized TV. After a shower, I lay down and turned on the TV to relax for a bit before going to sleep. About 30 minutes later, there was a sudden knock on the door. It felt strange, but I wasn't too worried. I got up, opened the door, and saw a man standing there. He was tall and skinny, with long hair and a beard. His speech was slurred, and I could tell he'd been drinking. He asked if he could come inside, just for a few minutes. I wasn't about to let a stranger in, so I told him no and shut the door. After closing it, I could tell he was still standing outside. I went back to bed, hoping he'd leave, but about 30 seconds later, he knocked again. This time I yelled at him to go away. I looked out the window and saw him walking off down the sidewalk. I thought he was gone, but about 5 minutes later, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. He was back, and this time he had something in his hand, a pipe. Without warning, he swung it at my window, making a loud noise. The glass didn't break right away, but after a few more hits, I heard it shatter. That's when I realized this guy was dangerous. I grabbed my phone, keys, and wallet, then ran to the bathroom and locked myself in. I could hear him smashing things in the room, hitting the TV, the walls, and other stuff. I called the police and told them what was happening. They said they'd be there as soon as possible, but I was terrified he'd break down the bathroom door before they arrived. He kept hitting things in the room, then came back toward the bathroom and hit the door a few times. Thankfully, it held up. After a minute, I heard sirens in the distance, but they didn't seem to scare him. Finally, the police arrived and yelled at the guy to stop. It felt like forever, but they eventually got him under control. When I came out, the room was a mess. He destroyed almost everything. Luckily, he hadn't hurt anyone. I had to get a new room, and the rest of the night was uneventful. The next morning, I got back on the road, but that was definitely the craziest hotel experience I've ever had. I was looking forward to a peaceful weekend away from the noise of city life, so I checked into a quaint little hotel on the edge of town. The receptionist, with a serious expression, warned me about room 217, saying it was haunted. I rolled my eyes, thinking it was just a silly local story. I was there for some quiet time, not ghost stories. That night, as I settled into bed, a chill crept through the room. The lights flickered, and I heard a faint whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "Help me." It seemed to echo, but I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Later, I woke up to the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth in the hallway. My curiosity got the better of me, so I got up to investigate. As I stepped into the corridor, the temperature dropped even more, and the whispers grew louder. My heart raced as I followed the sound until I reached the door of room 217, which was slightly ajar, almost inviting me in. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open and peered into a dimly lit room filled with dusty furniture. The air felt heavy with sadness. In the corner, I noticed an old rocking chair that creaked as if someone were sitting in it. An overwhelming sense of sorrow washed over me. Suddenly, a figure appeared. A woman in a tattered nightgown, her eyes filled with longing. "Help me. I'm trapped," she whispered, her voice echoing in the stillness. I felt a strong urge to help her, but I had no idea how. Before I could think, she pointed to a faded photograph on the wall. It showed her as a young girl surrounded by her smiling family. In that moment, I understood she had been forgotten, trapped between worlds. I promised her I would tell her stories so she wouldn't be alone anymore. As I left the room, the air felt lighter, and I sensed her gratitude. The next day, I checked out, forever changed by my encounter. I was determined to share her story, ensuring she would never be forgotten again. I needed a break from my usual routine, so I booked a last-minute stay at an upscale hotel. When I stepped into my room, I was amazed by how beautiful it was. The decor was stunning, the bed looked super comfy, and there was a large antique mirror hanging on the wall. As I unpacked, I caught a glimpse of my reflection, but something about it felt strange. That night, as I got ready for bed, I noticed the mirror shimmering oddly. When I looked closely, I thought I saw shadows dancing behind me. I quickly turned around, but the room was empty. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. A few hours later, I woke up to a soft voice calling my name. "Help me," it whispered. My heart raced as I sat up, scanning the dark room. The voice seemed to be coming from the mirror. I crept closer, feeling a chill in the air. In the mirror's reflection, I saw a woman with hollow eyes, trapped within the glass. "Help me. I can't escape," she pleaded, her voice full of desperation. I watched her struggle, clawing at the surface, and my heart ached for her. I reached out and placed my hand against the cold glass. "What do you need?" I asked, trembling. She pointed to a small box on the dresser behind me. I turned around but found it empty. Panic set in as I realized I was losing her. Desperate, I closed my eyes and whispered, "I promise to remember you." When I opened them again, the woman's face became clearer, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you," she said softly before fading away. The next morning, I checked out, feeling a weight lift from my heart. I knew I would share her story so she would never be forgotten. On a solo road trip, I decided to spend the night at a small hotel in a quiet town. The place was charming but a bit worn down. The receptionist handed me an old-fashioned key and a note that said, "Room 307, beware the clock." My curiosity was piqued, so I headed to my room. Once inside, I noticed an antique clock on the wall, but its hands were frozen at midnight. I tried to wind it, but it wouldn't budge. That night, as I fell asleep, I heard distant thunder, and the storm outside grew stronger. At midnight, I was jolted awake by the sound of the clock chiming, even though it hadn't moved. Confused, I sat up, and the air felt heavy. The room seemed alive, pulsing with energy, and shadows danced along the walls like flickering candlelight. Suddenly, I spotted a figure standing by the window, silhouetted against the lightning. My heart raced as I moved closer, but the figure turned and melted into the shadows. "Help me," a voice whispered, echoing in the stillness. "Who are you?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. The voice grew clearer. "I was trapped here, lost in time. Please help me escape." Compassion washed over me as I realized the spirit was connected to the clock. "Tell me how," I urged, desperate to help. "You must set the clock right," the voice replied. "Only then will I be free." I looked at the clock, feeling the weight of its history pressing down on me. I focused on the hands, willing them to move. With a surge of energy, the clock finally clicked, and the hands began to spin until they struck one. A wave of light filled the room, and the figure reappeared, this time clearer and brighter. "Thank you," she said, her face full of gratitude. "You freed me." As the light faded, a warm feeling filled the room. The clock chimed again, but this time it sounded comforting. The next morning, I checked out. Knowing I had experienced something truly special, the clock had resumed its duty as a keeper of time, and I promised to share her story with the world. On my road trip, I decided to stay at a charming hotel that looked inviting from the outside. The lobby had vintage furniture, and the atmosphere felt strangely nostalgic. The receptionist, a woman with an unsettling smile, handed me the key to room 203 and warned me that it had a peculiar reputation. This made me curious, so I headed to my room. Inside, the room was cozy, with floral wallpaper and a heavy wooden bed frame. As I settled in, I noticed a small photo on the bedside table. It showed a young woman with sad eyes. A shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off as my imagination getting the better of me. That night, I was suddenly woken up by a soft knock at the door. Groggy and confused, I stumbled to the door and peeked through the peephole, but no one was there. I shook it off, thinking it was just the wind. However, the knocking kept going, becoming more insistent. "Hello?" I called out, but all I heard was silence. The next morning, I mentioned the knocking to the receptionist. She turned pale and told me that the woman in the photo was a former guest who had mysteriously vanished from the hotel years ago. Since then, guests reported hearing her knocking, searching for a way out. A chill ran through me as I recounted my experience. That night, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I walked the hallways, calling out to the spirit. "Is anyone there?" The air felt thick and heavy, and I could hear faint whispers echoing in the distance. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of knocking coming from room 204, which was empty. I gathered my courage and opened the door, but it was dark and still. Just then, I caught a glimpse of the woman from the photo standing at the window, looking out into the night. "Help me," she mouthed, her eyes filled with sorrow. I felt a surge of compassion and reached out to her. "I'm here to help you." The air grew colder, and her form flickered like a candle in the wind. Then, with a sad smile, she faded away, leaving me with a deep sense of loss. The next morning, I checked out, my heart heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had failed her and that she was still trapped in the hotel. As I drove away, I glanced back at the building, vowing to share her story so she wouldn't be forgotten. On a whim, I decided to spend the weekend at a historical hotel famous for its beautiful architecture and ghost stories. When I checked in, the receptionist handed me an ornate key that felt heavier than it looked. She smiled, but there was a hint of worry in her eyes. "Just be careful with that room," she warned. "Strange things happen in room 312. Intrigued, I headed to my room. As soon as I entered, a chill wrapped around me, and the air felt thick with tension. The walls were covered in portraits of stern-looking people, and their eyes seemed to follow me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. That night, I settled into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. A scratching noise echoed from the corner of the room. My heart raced as I sat up and scanned the shadows. The noise continued, and I reluctantly got out of bed to check it out. I noticed a small door behind a heavy curtain that I hadn't seen before, but it was locked. Feeling a strong urge to discover what was behind it, I grabbed the ornate key from the bedside table. To my surprise, it fit perfectly in the lock. With a creak, the door swung open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase spiraling down into the depths of the hotel. My heart raced with curiosity, pushing my fear aside. I slowly descended the stairs, each step echoing loudly. At the bottom, I found myself in a dimly lit cellar filled with old furniture and dust-covered trunks. A chilling breeze swept through the room, and I could hear soft whispers, like the walls were speaking to me. Suddenly, I spotted a dusty mirror propped against the wall. I stepped closer, and as I looked into it, I saw not just my reflection, but a shadowy figure standing behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Panic surged through me as I turned back to the mirror. The figure was closer now, its features becoming clearer. A thin man with hollow eyes and a sad expression. "Help me," he mouthed silently, desperation written all over his face. "Find the truth." I felt a strong urge to help him, but I had no idea what he meant. Stumbling backward, I knocked over a trunk that fell open, revealing old newspapers and photographs. As I sifted through them, I found an article about a man who had disappeared from the hotel decades ago, last seen entering room 312. Realizing this was the man from the mirror, I knew I had to uncover the truth about what happened to him. "I'll help you," I whispered, my heart racing. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, filling the cellar with voices urging me to leave. Feeling overwhelmed, I raced back up the stairs and into my room, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I checked out of the hotel, the haunted key still heavy in my pocket. As I left, I felt the man's presence fade, but I promised to tell his story so he wouldn't be forgotten. On a whim, I ended up staying at a charming old hotel in a small town. The place had a cozy feel, and the receptionist, a sweet elderly woman with kind eyes, handed me the key to room 15. As she did, she casually mentioned an attic that guests sometimes explored. I didn't think much of it at the time and made my way to my room. Later that evening, curiosity got the best of me. I wandered around the hotel, admiring old photographs of what the building used to look like. Eventually, I found a door that led to the attic. Feeling a bit adventurous, I opened it. The wooden stairs creaked with every step as I climbed up, and a musty smell hit me the moment I reached the top. Dust covered everything, old furniture, trunks, and what seemed like forgotten memories hanging in the air. As I explored, I started feeling like I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Just as I was about to head back downstairs, I heard it, a soft humming coming from the far corner of the attic. My heart raced, but I was too curious to walk away. I moved closer. In the dim light, I saw her, a woman in a long dress, her hair flowing down her back, gently humming a lullaby. She seemed lost in thought, completely unaware of me at first. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. "Excuse me?" I finally said, my voice shaky. She stopped humming and slowly turned to face me. Her eyes were sad, and a chill ran down my spine when I realized she wasn't just another guest. She was a ghost. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. My heart pounded. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I was the keeper of this hotel," she replied softly. "I waited here for my family to come back, but they never did." Her words were heavy with grief, and I felt her loneliness like it was my own. She had been waiting, stuck in this attic for years, forgotten. I didn't know what to say at first, but I wanted to help. "Your family wouldn't want you to stay here like this," I said gently. "You can move on and find peace. You don't have to wait anymore." She looked at me, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know how," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll make sure your story is told," I promised. "You won't be forgotten." As soon as I said that, the room filled with a soft, warm light. I watched as her figure slowly started to fade, becoming lighter, almost peaceful. "Thank you," she whispered, and then she disappeared into the light. I stood there for a moment, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. I had helped her move on, and that thought filled me with a sense of fulfillment. The next morning, I checked out of the hotel, her story fresh in my mind. I knew I had to share it with the world, so she'd never be forgotten again. I arrived at a small, quiet hotel, hoping for a peaceful weekend away from the city. When I checked in, the receptionist handed me the key to room 9. With a small smile, she said, "This is one of our oldest rooms. Some people say it's haunted, but don't worry, it's harmless." That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The room had old, vintage furniture, and the ting of an old clock echoed in the silence. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of soft crying. Startled, I sat up and listened closely. The sound was coming from the bathroom. Nervously, I got out of bed and walked toward the door. "Hello?" I called, but there was no answer. I slowly pushed the door open, and just like that, the crying stopped. The bathroom was empty, but when I looked in the mirror, I saw something strange. Faint handprints were forming on the fogged-up glass. My heart started racing. I stumbled back into the main room, reaching for my phone to call the front desk, but there was barely any signal. Just then, the crying started again, louder this time. "Please, help me," a voice whispered. Determined to figure out what was going on, I remembered what the receptionist said about the room's history. The next morning, I did some research and found out that a young girl had disappeared many years ago. She was last seen in room 9. That night, I returned to the room, more focused. I sat on the floor and spoke softly, "I'm here to help you. You're not alone." The air around me seemed to shift, filled with emotion, and the crying turned into quiet whispers. "Find me. Find my toy." Suddenly, the room got colder, and a faint glow appeared in the corner. I followed it to an old, dusty trunk hidden under the bed. Inside, I found a small, worn-out teddy bear. As soon as I held it, the room seemed to warm up, and the whispers turned into soft laughter. "I can go now," the voice said, and a gentle breeze swept through the room. The heaviness I had felt disappeared, and I knew the little girl had found peace. The next morning, as I checked out, I kept the teddy bear with me, promising to share her story and make sure she wouldn't be forgotten. I checked into an old hotel that was known for its vintage style and spooky stories. The receptionist smiled at me, but hesitated when I asked about the upper floors. "You might want to stay away from the 4th floor," she said, almost like a warning. That only made me more curious. After settling into my room on the 3rd floor, I couldn't stop thinking about what she said. I knew I had to see the 4th floor for myself. Late that night, when everything was quiet, I snuck out of my room and headed for the stairs. Each step creaked loudly, and the further I went, the colder the air seemed to get. When I reached the 4th floor, I was hit with a feeling of dread. The hallway was barely lit, and it felt like the air was pressing down on me. I walked slowly, looking at the closed doors along the corridor. Even though they were shut, I could feel something strange coming from them. Then I heard a soft giggle. My heart jumped, and I froze in place. "Hello?" I called, but no one answered. The giggle seemed to come from room 401, so I opened the door and stepped inside. The room looked untouched, covered in dust, like no one had been there for years. As soon as I entered, the door slammed shut behind me. Panic set in, and I spun around, trying to figure out what was happening. The temperature dropped even more, and I started hearing whispers, faint but eerie. "You shouldn't be here," they said. Even though I was scared, I knew I had to stay calm. "Who are you?" I yelled into the dark room. The whispers grew louder, forming into a voice full of sadness. "We're trapped. Help us." It hit me then. I was talking to spirits, people who had been forgotten. "How can I help?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Remember us. Tell our story," they said. The room got even colder, and I felt a rush of energy around me. I promised right then and there that I would share their stories so they wouldn't be forgotten. The whispers slowly faded, replaced by a calm feeling. The door creaked open, and I rushed out, my heart still racing. The next morning, when I checked out, I knew I had a responsibility. I had promised to tell their stories, and I felt their gratitude as I left the hotel. That feeling of warmth stayed with me long after I was gone. This happened to me last year while I was on a business trip. I arrived at the hotel and picked up the room key that my company had paid for. The hotel looked nice enough, though it was smaller than most. There were about 30 or 40 rooms spread over 3 stories. My room was on the top floor, so I took the elevator up and made my way down the hallway. When I got to my room, I put my bags down and reached into my pocket for the key. Just then, the door to the room next to mine opened, and a man stepped out into the hallway. He smiled and greeted me, saying he was my neighbor, then offered his hand for a handshake. I was a little confused, but shook his hand and told him my name. After that, I went into my room, and I noticed he went right back into his room and closed the door. It felt a little weird that someone would come out of their hotel room just to say hi, but I shrugged it off. Some people are just like that, I guess. I unpacked my small suitcase and duffel bag, then laid on the bed and turned on the TV. It was late, and I was tired from the flight, so I planned to get to bed early. After a quick shower, I turned off the lights and tried to fall asleep. About 20 minutes later, I heard the neighbor's door creak open, followed by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I could see the shadow of someone walking by my door, but they stopped right outside my room. Through the small strip of light under the door, I saw their shadow move closer, almost like they were peeking in. After a second, the shadow backed away and continued down the hall. That freaked me out. I got up, double-checked the locks on the door, and then went back to bed, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The next day, I went to meet my coworkers at a company office for a presentation and dinner. I didn't get back to the hotel until around 10 p.m., exhausted. I tossed my work bag on the bed and jumped in the shower. I was in there for about 10 minutes when, through the sound of the water, I heard the unmistakable beep of the electronic door lock unlocking. It was way too late for housekeeping, and the first thing that popped into my head was that creepy guy from next door. But I had no idea how he could have a key to my room. I stood frozen in the shower, listening as the door slowly opened and then shut. I could hear footsteps walking past the bathroom. My heart was pounding because whoever it was had to know I was in the shower. Terrified, I stepped out as quietly as I could and quickly threw on a pair of pants. I pressed my ear against the bathroom door and listened. I heard faint noises like someone rummaging through my bags. I was too scared to confront them. I didn't know if they had a weapon or what their intentions were. I felt completely helpless, paralyzed with fear. Then the room went silent. My phone was on the nightstand, out of reach, but I knew I had to do something. I decided that making noise might scare them off. Taking a deep breath, I banged on the bathroom door and yelled for help as loud as I could. I heard the footsteps run back toward the door and out into the hallway. I rushed out, locked the door, and grabbed my phone with shaky hands. I called 911 and then the front desk to report what happened. By the time the police arrived, the guy was long gone. Luckily, they found him in his car a few hours later. I don't know if he ever faced jail time, though, because they couldn't prove what his intentions were. But honestly, I'm convinced he was trying to kidnap me. There's no other reason I can think of for why he'd break into my room when he knew I was in there. It still creeps me out to think about what might have happened if I hadn't scared him off. Every summer, my family and I take a vacation to a new hotel or resort. It's usually me, my wife, and our 2 little boys. We tend to stay at the resort rather than go sightseeing, which makes things cheaper, and it's just more relaxing that way. On the morning we arrived, we unpacked, and the kids immediately wanted to go to the water park. My wife and I sat on chairs near the pool while the boys played with other kids at the water park next to it. After a couple of hours in the sun, we decided to head back to our room to get ready for dinner. I went to look for the boys and quickly found Sam, the older one. I asked him where Alan, the younger one, was, and he said Alan was playing with another kid on the other side of the park. I told Sam to go back to his mom while I went to find Alan. I walked around for about 10 minutes, starting to get nervous, when I finally spotted Alan. He was sitting in the back corner of the park, talking to a boy about his age. There was a couple sitting in the chairs nearby, who I assumed were the boy's parents. I introduced myself, but they didn't say much, just gave me a slight smile. It felt a bit awkward, but I told Alan we were leaving for dinner and led him back to the room. On the way, I asked Alan about his new friend. He said they'd been playing together, but then he mentioned something strange. He said the boy had introduced him to his parents, who had invited him to join them for dinner that night. I thought it was really odd for someone to invite a little kid to dinner without even speaking to his parents. As soon as we got to the room, I told my wife, and she was just as worried as I was. We decided to grab a quick dinner and then came back to the hotel around 5 p.m. The kids were exhausted, so we figured we'd relax for the rest of the evening. When we got into the elevator to head up to our room, Alan's new friend and his mom were standing there as if they were waiting for the elevator to go down. The mother smiled and asked if Alan could join them for dinner. I glanced at my wife, who looked just as confused as I was. Then I told the lady, "We already had dinner tonight, but maybe we can work something out for tomorrow." Her smile faded, and she walked away down the hallway. It felt really strange, like they had been waiting by the elevator just to ask us. When we got into our room, we pulled Alan aside and told him he wasn't allowed to go near that family unless one of us was with him. He seemed upset, but agreed. I also talked to Sam, telling him to keep an eye on his little brother if we weren't around. We spent the evening relaxing, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I kept hoping the next day would be better. Later that night, we all went to bed. My wife and I slept in one bed, and the boys shared the other. A few hours into the night, I was woken up by Sam shaking my arm. He whispered that Alan was talking to someone at the door. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the front door. From the little I could see, Alan was trying to figure out how to unlock it, and I heard a faint voice on the other side. I yelled for Alan to back away from the door, and he jumped, startled. I slammed my hand against the door, and I heard footsteps running down the hallway. In my anger, I threw open the door and saw a man turning the corner toward the elevators. I ran after him, but didn't see him anywhere. He wouldn't have had time to take the elevator, so I knew he was staying on our floor. After searching for a few minutes, I went back to the room and told my wife to lock the door while I went to the front desk. By the time I got there, my adrenaline was fading, and I tried to stay calm as I explained what had happened. The woman at the counter called a security guard and her manager, but after a short discussion, it became clear they couldn't do much. They had no cameras in the hallways, only at the entrances and exits. There was no proof, and I didn't get a good look at the man at the door. I figured it was the father of Alan's friend, but I couldn't prove it. The best they could offer was a refund for the remaining days. So we moved to another resort about 30 minutes away. It's a terrible feeling as a parent to know that someone might have been trying to kidnap your child and there's nothing you can do about it. I hate thinking that those people are probably still out there trying to lure other kids into their trap. And what creeps me out the most is the possibility that the boy with them might have been someone else's missing child, used to lure in more innocent kids. When I was 18 and in my senior year of high school, I played on our school's softball team. That year, we were doing really well, and we got invited to a tournament in Las Vegas. I remember we stayed at a hotel about 15 minutes from the city. We arrived around 9 p.m., and after checking in, we split up into different rooms. I shared a room with 3 of my close friends. An hour later, we were unpacked and settling in, trying to wind down for the night because our first game was scheduled early the next morning. I was already half asleep when the phone in our room suddenly rang. It startled all of us because, honestly, I had stayed in hotels before, and the room phone never rang. We all exchanged confused looks, and eventually, I agreed to answer it. I picked up the phone and said, "Hello." A man's voice, almost whispering, responded. He said that we hadn't paid for the room, and that one of us needed to come down to the lobby to take care of it. Right away, alarms were going off in my head. I knew this wasn't right. I had seen our coach pay for the room earlier, and we wouldn't have been given keys if we hadn't paid. Plus, if something had really gone wrong, they wouldn't be calling us at this hour. I told the man we had already paid, but he ignored me and insisted that just one of us had to come down. His voice sounded more frustrated now, and then he said if we didn't, there would be consequences. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. There was no way I was letting any of us go down to the lobby. I told the man we'd be staying in our room and someone could come up to escort us if there was a real issue. Then I hung up. I explained to my friends what had happened and told them I had a really bad feeling about it. They all agreed it didn't make sense. It's rare for a hotel to call a guest that late at night, and we knew the room was paid for. We were on edge, but we decided to try and get some sleep. The phone rang a few more times throughout the night, but none of us answered. The next morning, we told our coach about what happened. He asked the person at the front desk if there had been a problem with the payment, but to our horror, they had no idea what we were talking about. They insisted that the front desk wouldn't have called us that late at night. They even said they'd checked the security cameras, but we never heard anything back from them for the rest of our stay. Luckily, nothing else happened to us, but the whole situation left me really disturbed. I still have so many questions. Who called us? Why did they want one of us to leave the room alone in the middle of the night? And how did they know which room we were in? The more I think about it, the more creeped out I get. But I'm just grateful we stayed put that night.